And so when I think I was emailing him about a reference for something else.
So he was over there in the UK with you, and then he came here, and sucked you over.
Exactly.
We're live.
Right
Kieran Ford, thank you for joining us. Welcome along.
No worries. Good to be here.
Now, this is our first podcast since the terror attacks attacks because there was 2 mosques in Christchurch.
Yeah.
You wrote a very interesting op-ed. Did you write it for the ODT, or did they just pick up it, or was it a blog post that they picked up on?
No, I wrote it for the ODT.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was in the ODT the day after, and since then we've been communicating about certainly coming and having a chat about this. Whatever this is, it's a pretty massively horrible topic in some ways. So as you know, and as people know listening, the Department of Conversation is sort of more conversational rather than interview, but obviously there's a pretty big theme around our connection and conversation, which is the Christchurch terror attacks. And it's interesting, actually. I've noticed that in the media they've started to talk about the events of Christchurch and what happened in Christchurch. I feel really uncomfortable not labeling it what it feels like it is. I don't want to lose that word, not because I enjoy the word, but it was terrorism, and it's a terrorist attack. And I just hope that even a couple of weeks later the media is not sort of starting to already sort of talk about that event. You know what I mean?
For sure. And I think to add something to that, I think we need to remember that it was an attack on Muslims as well. And I think that aspect gets lost when they talk about the attacks on Christchurch.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the media, do you think the media should keep the community, the Muslim community, at the forefront, as well as remember it's not just an everyday sort of event, this was a terrorist attack?
For sure, yeah, definitely.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you're from the UK?
Yeah.
We were just talking about that as we came in. You did your Masters at Cambridge?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Where they do all the boat races?
That's the one, yeah.
Is it Cambridge, Oxford? Is that where they have the big boat races?
That's right, yeah.
Most I know about that is from the Borat movie. I think Borat
Does he go there?
Maybe he's not in that. No, I'm wrong. Not in the movie, but he does definitely.
Oh, yeah, no, I've seen the clip of him walking down there. Yeah.
And then you've come to New Zealand basically following a supervisor.
Yeah, so my supervisor currently, he taught me at undergrad, and we'd kept in touch, and my research interests were very closely aligned to his.
Which are?
Terrorism, counter-terrorism, and in particular what we call critical approaches to terrorism, which is a research approach that tries to ask deep questions about the way that we frame terrorism, the way that we frame responses to terrorism, that asks questions around states and state use of violence in the context of political violence, that asks what could non-violent approaches be to countering terrorism and so on.
So when you say ask deep questions, that implies you maybe would like to ask questions and go 1 or 2 steps further than that initial response. That initial response, which is often either force or security, and so you want to go to and then what?
Precisely, or indeed to ask the question of whether that approach is helping, or what are the forms of violence that might be being produced through state responses to terrorism. So, a classic example in that might be like a drone strike, for instance, right? That's a very violent approach to, or a violent response to violence. So it's important to be able to kind of question everything in that context. Certainly trying to explore what other approaches you could take rather than just a security response. And that actually was one of the main reasons I wanted to write that article in the ODT, was to add to the conversation and turn to, because I've spent quite a few years now looking at Britain's response to terrorism and extremism, and spent a great number of years being frustrated and angered at the security response in the UK and the incredibly negative impacts that has had on particularly Muslim communities in the UK, and particularly people of colour, in terms of racial profiling and so on and so forth. So when it came to the Friday of these attacks, I was really very nervous, because this was evidently some sense of something new, or opening a different chapter, or it was a really important thing in terms of New Zealand's kind of contemporary story, I suppose. And I was very nervous that they might try and learn from the approaches of the UK or of France or of the US, because I think those responses in those countries has been pretty traumatic.
Do you think, I'm thinking about the responses in the US, that's often the time when they maybe point the finger at a minority group, let's say the Muslim community. And this is the reverse, though. This is the Muslim community being attacked. Do you think, did you still have those concerns?
Well, there's been plenty of figures that have still pointed the finger at Muslim communities.
Like the guy in Australia. The thing that I was confused
about... Or Rupert
about,
Murdoch said something very similar.
Oh, did he? Well, the thing that confused me about that senator in Australia is summarising what he said was because of the extremist Muslim influence allowed into New Zealand. And I was like, well, even if that has happened somewhere, forget if it has or hasn't, but even if it has, how does an extremist Muslim view lead to a white nationalist killing a bunch of Muslims?
Well, there's no point trying to understand that with a logic.
So you're giving me permission to go, I don't fucking get that, I'm leaving that alone.
Yeah, it's bollocks, yeah.
Because it made no sense, because I guess okay, so I was about to say, I guess we were trying to say, but we're saying, let's just not even give that any credit.
Nah.
Yeah, okay.
Nah, let's not talk about that.
So, you're talking about how perhaps places like France and the UK have done it in the past. So your concerns were what? Your concerns were what would happen. Were you particularly concerned about the Muslim community, even though it was an attack on the Muslim community, or just minorities in general?
Well, certainly every counter-extremism approach globally has negatively impacted people of colour and Muslim communities.
Right.
So, yes, certainly was nervous for that.
Am I naive? Sorry, I'm not going to. I just want to get this out. Am I naive to even think that could never have happened in New Zealand because it was Muslims that were attacked? So how could they be then the subject of whatever was going to happen from the government or from groups, because they're the victims here?
Well, what's very clear about all of the counter-terrorism approaches that New Zealand has been taking so far in the last, let's say, since 9/11, like in the last 20 years, or just under 20 years, they have, and they've admitted this since what happened the other Friday, that all of that focus has been on militant Islam,
right?
Or sort of the same sort of threats that its partners in Five Eyes and so on are focusing on. And so any ramping up of a security response on this is going to ramp up all of that focus. It's going to ramp up that kind of impact. So, yeah, I think it's important that we're not naive to the fact that that New Zealand is a part of those wider processes.
So for people like me, who maybe are, I was going to say happy to be naive, not happy to be naive, but who are naive to perhaps what it's like to be in a minority, what it's like to be a person of colour, to be in the Muslim community, what do I need to understand? This is a pretty big question. This feels like it should be a wrap-up question, but yeah, we're here, so let's ask it. What do I need to understand? As I say, it seems incongruent to me that the Muslim community would be the target of focus after the attacks than because they were the victims of the attack. So I'd like to understand that more.
Right.
I need to speak to more Muslims about that. Probably.
For sure. Yeah. I'm not the person to answer that question.
Totally.
Really.
As I ask that question, and just so you know, and just so people out there know, there are several people we have approached to speak, including the Muslim community. But obviously, 2 weeks after, the Muslim community are looking after their own, and we've invited people to come and join us and to educate me, to be a part of these conversations, and perhaps in the next couple of weeks we will hear more from them involved with this particular show, what we're doing. So we're going to do that. We want to do that.
That's good. And I think there's certainly been a lot of evidence in the last couple of weeks that New Zealand more broadly has been ignoring calls and concerns, and I mean, there's certainly been lots of groups who have put out reports to government warning about the number of hate crimes and attacks and so on in New Zealand. So I think, that there's definitely a hugely important process of listening and learning and reflection that New Zealand needs to do.
So it sounds like what you're saying is one of the things is that New Zealand, it would seem like the Western world, has been focused on Islamist extremism, and right-wing extremism has not necessarily been going under the radar, but hasn't been the source of concern for many Western countries.
Yes, I think that's absolutely fair. I think if you look at the ODT, or you look at other kind of news reports in New Zealand, what's quite interesting is you can piece together different isolated incidents. There was a couple of neo-Nazis in Dunedin in the Octagon attacked a Muslim woman wearing a veil, and then that's sort of isolated as if it's an exceptional incident that is of no wider concern, so that no one's joining those dots. And there's that, I think, an active ignorance around that.
And of course, one of the biggest ironies is certainly in America that I think, Jace, you can probably bring up some of these stats. I think that all the deaths by terrorist attacks last year have been attributed to right-wing terrorism.
Yep. But at the same time, Donald Trump has he's cut all funding for counter-extremism programs against right-wing extremism.
So here's some numbers that Jason got for us. I mean, if you have a look at just 2017, this is in the US, I guess. Right-wing 36, Islamist extremism 7. Islamist extremism, what's that, 16 there, side by side. Oh, total fatalities in the US by category. Yeah, so we, meaning the Western world, have either been willfully ignorant or have missed it. Do you think we've been willfully ignorant?
Yeah, I think there is willful conscious ignorance in there, and
there was
different people in different ways. I mean, Donald Trump is a great example of one particular type of willful ignorance, in the sense of actively cutting a program, and I think there's at the other end of the spectrum, there's an interesting discussion to be had when there's been in the last week or so, there's been some very interesting pieces in the media that have challenged the narrative of this isn't New Zealand when this attack happened, by saying actually categorically that is New Zealand.
Yeah, there's pushback.
If you look at the history of settlement in New Zealand, that's an incredibly violent history. If you look at the spate of attacks on Muslims in New Zealand in the last few years, this is New Zealand. So that's been very interesting too.
I saw something, and I can't remember her name, but Jason, if you go to my Facebook page, I posted her video. There was an Australian commentator who was talking about, when I say, are we being willfully ignorant, part of it makes me think, therefore, it's something we don't want to see. Why don't we want to see it? And there was don't go past Bill and Ted, you keep going. Go past my dog in a tutu. Keep on going. Keep on trucking. Keep on trucking. Keep on trucking. That's it. That's it right there. And this lady here talks about an Islamist terrorist in America. Just pause it there. Who killed 50 people in the nightclub, and the way the newspaper covered it. So when the absolutely terrorist in Christchurch did this is the headline: Angelic boy. Oh look, just play a minute of it and you'll get her point.
Killer. Angelic boy. Is that really the best descriptor for a man who just opened fire on a mosque? Is there not a more fitting adjective that you could have used? The same paper covered the Orlando nightclub shooting in 2016. This was its front page.
ISIS maniac kills 50 in gay club.
I want to compare the two for a minute. Same paper, similar crime, similar death toll. One starts with angelic boy, the other with ISIS maniac.
So if you just fade that down, I mean, you can probably scroll to the end there, and one of the conclusions she draws, or questions she asks, is, if we see ourselves in the terrorist, we're less likely to want to, say that they are a maniac killer, whereas the others, the people of colour or people from Islam, they're obviously just savages. But this was an angelic boy who, how did he possibly lose his way?
Yeah.
And I wonder if we are being willfully ignorant, there's some truth in that.
Yeah, and there's implicit bias, explicit bias in terms of the way that different attacks are treated. Yeah, I mean, the T word gets people are nervous to talk about right-wing terrorism as and a very jump the gun and talk about Islamic extremism or Islamic terrorism.
So you say people are less likely to want to use the word terrorism when it's right-wing?
Yeah.
So what do we say? Right-wing extremism, right-wing fundamentalism.
Or in many cases before the new, with rolling news coverage, there have been many cases of white supremacists attacking or shooting or killing or whatever it might have been, and before the details have come out, they've described it as probably an Al-Qaeda attack or something like this, right?
Right.
So
so as soon as something happens that they can attach to a Muslim, it's an Al-Qaeda attack, it's a ISIS attack, it's a fundamentally Islamic terrorist, but that's before the details out. But when it's a rancher from Texas killing 20 people with a gun, it's let's just wait and see what the facts show us.
And also you can there are plenty of examples of where the responses to those incidents are much more likely to be incredibly violent, leading to the deaths of the perpetrators in the cases where it is a person of color or a Muslim. So there are many cases in the US being with its history of freedom around gun control and so on, where sort of groups of white supremacist militants kind of patriot, kind of label themselves as sort of patriot, trying to think of the right word, just groups of white men who are armed, marching around and patrolling their own properties and coming face to face with the police and National Guard and having armed standoffs that don't lead to the deaths of perpetrators, but lead to ridiculously small imprisonment or sentencing or whatever,
or even the ability to carry those weapons. I remember watching a piece on Fox News with Sean Hannity, and he was talking about he carries a handgun. Talking about when the police pull him over, how he gets out of his car and reaches into his thing and he brings out the gun carefully. And the commentator that was watching this was going, if a black man of your same age just put his hand in there, he'd be shot. To even be able to have the ability to pull it out and say, I'm carrying a gun and putting it down is a privilege that he has that a minority doesn't.
Well, I think when it comes to something like Fox News, we need to kind of distinguish an idea around willful ignorance, as we were saying, into active white supremacy. We need to distinguish those two, I think. So it's certainly really important that we all increase our awareness of I guess the state of play at the moment globally, and how unjustly imbalanced and how unjustly violent life is for some people, and how different it is for others. So we need to really take stock of that.
What can we do about it?
I
mean, let me take one half step back. When you say so unjustly balanced, are we talking on a global scale? Are we talking about tribes in Africa without clean drinking water? Are we talking about solo mums living in South Dunedin who are needing support? Are we talking about minorities? Are we talking about Māori imprisonment rates? Or is it all of the above? And if it is all of the above, is that when people start to tune out because it's just too much?
Right. Yeah, these things are immensely complicated. So, I think let's start from here. I think from my experience of looking at Britain's counter-extremism strategy, it's caused a lot more problems and a lot more violence and a lot more injustice through its attempt to isolate one particular form of violence from others. So it is attempting to isolate extremist violence from other forms of violence in society, and is attempting then to tackle that form of violence by itself.
So does that mean they need to be able to label it and quantify it to put it into that category?
Yeah, I mean that's what they're you can understand why they're doing this in many ways, because it needs to be achievable or measurable, or it's a lot easier to tackle one form of violence and to stigmatize one form of violence than it is to tackle all violence.
Okay.
But that form of violence is intimately linked to a form of violence that the British state is not comfortable talking about, which is Britain's foreign policy, Britain's colonial legacy, Britain's complicity in drone strikes, in enhanced interrogation techniques, torture, et cetera, et cetera. So you listed all a whole number of different injustices in New Zealand, and I think all of those are linked. And so it does become very complicated, but it also becomes somehow obvious as well as to the fact that we need to have very difficult questions about how violent life is, and how we need to address that. It seems I tried to make it sound simple and just made it sound immensely complicated.
Well, it's an interesting thing. I was talking to someone just last night about the violent society we live in, and we were kind of thinking to and fro and thinking about, the society of yesteryear was more violent. So I kind of want to unpack that with you, if you would, mate. The violent society we live in. And I mean, we were kind of two idiots trying to talk it out, and I was thinking, I like MMA. I like watching it. I like Conor McGregor. I love rugby, sort of thing.
It's interesting. I saw a clip of MMA the other night, and I turned to my wife and said, I can't believe people still do this. Then we started talking about gladiators and things like that.
Well, inherently a violent sport, but a chosen activity as well. Is that part of the violent society we're talking about? Or again, not to throw all these examples out because I don't want to kind of hinder the conversation, or are we talking about, the beating up of someone wearing a veil in the octagon?
Right.
Or is it linear, and does it continue on into everything?
So when you were speaking, I think a thought came to my mind, which was I went to the vigil at the stadium last week, and there was what I felt to be a very clear contradiction in two of the speakers.
Okay.
That I think perhaps starts to sum up some or offers a way into this conversation, which is a contradiction between something that Dave Cull, the mayor, said, and then something that the president of the Otago Muslim Association said immediately afterwards. So Dave Cull stands up and says, Dunedin is safe. And then that's one of the things he said. And then immediately the next speaker comes up and says, obviously paraphrasing here, but something along the lines of, there is not a Muslim in this stadium who has not been attacked.
Wow.
So how do those two things operate in the same space, right?
And also, to say Dunedin is safe, my first thought would be, Dave, what's your metric for that? How do you measure that?
Right.
I know since the attack, and maybe that's unfair to use that as a metric, I've read stories in the ODT and online about, kids not wanting to go to school wearing their headscarves because they don't want to be singled out. Muslim families not leaving their properties for a week and a half because they were fearful.
Yep.
That doesn't sound very safe for them.
No, absolutely not.
Not to move from one tragedy to another, but David Bain happened in Dunedin, which was another mass shooting. There was a mass shooting at Aramoana, the last one actually. So when we say Dunedin is safe, what's the metric for that?
Yeah, and then on the other side of things, I've used this statistic in my writing and I haven't got it on the top of my head, but if you look at the number of people who died in 9/11,
it's about 3,500, 3,000 something.
It was 2,992 or something like this. And then if you look at the amount of people who died as a result of gun shootings in I think even just in New York in the year following, that number is many times higher than the number. So when you start listing all the different mass shootings, I think on one level it's important to acknowledge that these things are incredibly rare, that these things are that we as a society, when we describe something as terrorism, we exceptionalize that as a form of violence that we are very, very scared of.
Yeah.
And we ignore other forms of violence. And we'd name sort of gun violence in the US. And as a society, we ignore violence against people of color and Muslims. And
there'll be some people who go, don't talk right, I never ignore that violence. But you're saying that trends within society demonstrate that we ignore that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the global investment and the death and the destruction of the war on terror as a really good example of how certain deaths are valued more than others, I suppose.
It's such a... I'm interested as well, the counter, not counter-terrorism, the counter-radicalisation efforts. Mm-hmm. And part of your research started off in the UK with looking at what they do in schools. Yeah. And there's a group in schools, it's like the equivalent of, they make the curriculum sort of thing. And they bring up, Jason, can we bring that page up? It's a group called, they have to teach by law, is it the British values? What are British values? And the British values, according to this group, Ofsted, that's who it is, are democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect for and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs, and for those without faith. So that is something that must be taught in schools.
That's correct, yeah.
As a counter-radicalisation tactic.
Yeah.
Is that the reason for it, or is it just a way... Is it smaller than that? And it's just like, because we need you all to get along, kids.
No, it's precisely that. This definition, or this idea of what's called fundamental British values, that first appears in what's called the PREVENT strategy. So that's Britain's counter-extremism strategy.
So this is a strategy tied to extremism and terrorism.
Yes.
So a way that it's getting taught in the schools to help that situation.
Yes.
Yeah. You paused, so I'm thinking that's what they're trying to do.
That's what they're trying to do, yes.
I'm suspicious that you're going to say that it's not. What is it? How's it going?
Badly.
Okay.
Badly. So these values emerged in 2011.
Right.
When for some years the government had... let's take the story back to 2005, which is when... London's transport network was attacked.
That was the bus bombs?
Yeah, there was one person on a bus and
7/7.
3 people. Yes, yeah, 7th of July 2005. And so after, what was I suppose interesting about that for the UK when they were started to think about how to respond was that these were 4 individuals who had grown up in the UK.
Right.
So rather than the attacks in New York in 2001, which were attacks by people who had lived in other countries. This was from 4 people who had grown up in Yorkshire.
Were they radicalised there, or were they people who had gone off to different places, become radicalised and come back? Do we know?
Or I suppose a mixture. This idea of radicalisation itself, it's important to mention, is incredibly contested as an academic term. There's very, very little science to prove that it is a thing at all. So it's interesting that it's a term that is globally used.
So how would you, not to stop the conversation about 7/7, how would you reference someone who has, let's say, taken on an ideology that's led them to be involved in a terror attack? What would be a better way to describe it rather than radicalised from an academic point of view?
I suppose academically speaking, there isn't a term to use that as to say use this instead currently. I think one problem with the idea of radicalization is that it suggests that an individual goes from being, let's say, a moderate or a normal. This kind of idea creates this idea that there is such a thing as normal.
Yeah.
And then encounters some sort of idea or ideology.
Okay.
And that then makes them want to use violence.
Right.
Now, what's problematic about that, apart from the fact that there is...
So they go from the angelic boy to the mass murderer.
Right. That's kind of the kind of the logic. And I mean, there's enormous problems with this. For a start, there's absolutely no science to be able to demonstrate how someone goes along this apparent process.
Yeah.
But there's a massive problem at the end, which is that that violence is used by moderates, right? Like Tony Blair wanted to achieve his political ideology, so he used violence to do that in Iraq.
But he wasn't radicalized.
Apparently not.
Yeah,
no.
yeah.
So like there's real problems with this idea of radicalization.
That's a really interesting thought. Okay, let's. I don't want to hamper we're talking about 7/7.
Yeah.
And we're talking about the Ofsted
and
ideas.
these values come from. So in 2005, this idea of radicalization emerged as a way of, well, I would say it emerged as a way for the British government to speak about the rise of political violence in a way that didn't get us to question violence in society as a whole, but got us to think about an ideology. And it pinpointed and spotlighted this idea of ideology as being the key factor.
Right.
It's important to mention, again, there's no science to prove this.
Okay.
But what's convenient about focusing on ideology is that it keeps the spotlight away from foreign policy, from the geopolitical sphere more broadly, and instead isolates certain ideas as being threatening. So the reason why these values exist is because, well, for two reasons. One is because if you're going to focus on ideologies, then you're going to need some sort of counter ideology. So these values are for the British government, they succinctly demonstrate somehow an idea of what moderate ideology should be.
Okay.
But
bring them back up, Jace, just so we can
so
keep them on.
these are ideas like democracy, and I mean they're sort of wishy-washy values in the sense of like, I mean, like democracy. It's literally just the word democracy. But democracy can be everything from anarcho-syndicalism, right, all the way through to a constitutional monarchy. So, like, where in there are we going to grab?
And I guess it sounds like what you're sort of saying as well, and who gets to define it?
Yeah.
Who gets to decide? I mean, I don't know how it's referenced in the UK, but this is curriculum. This is a core curriculum subject. It has to be taught.
Yes.
That's how you'd call it. It'd be a core curriculum idea. Has to be taught.
Yeah, so,
and then who decides
Ofsted, so everyone's aware, Ofsted are the school inspectors. So they're the body that go around and check up to make sure schools are doing all the stuff they should be doing. And so one of the things that they end up doing is they check that the school is promoting these values. And
how do you promote individual liberty? That seems to be something that's...
So part of my research...
I mean, straight away you get into, say, for example, a minority-held view.
Right.
Whatever it is. I mean, I used to do talkback, and when I'd bring up this example, I'd say dog owners are a minority. We're all minorities somewhere, not to try and move away from anyone getting a picture in the head of what I'm talking about, but just whatever that minority-held view is, their individual liberty, by definition, may impinge on somebody else's individual liberty.
Yeah, there is a huge amount of contradiction here. So, like... let's see if I can say this succinctly, but pluralism, the idea that different people can hold on to different ideas, is like a core value of a democracy broadly. I think that's a fairly uncontested thing to say. But this counter-extremism strategy is designed to try and get as many people within the moderate ideology as possible. So there's a counter-extremism strategy that is actually trying to put barriers on what is permitted and what is allowed. So they're trying to put on barriers on pluralism, which is the very value that they're trying to defend. So there's some core contradictions and tensions that emerge when you're trying to claim what moderate is. And individual liberty is, to kind of answer your question, because it is quite interesting actually. So part of my research has been to look at the way that these values are being promoted in schools. Yeah. And rather, some schools seem to do it by like having a values week. So on Monday, their school assembly, they'll talk about democracy, and on Wednesday they'll talk about liberty or whatever. And other ways that schools do it is they kind of embed it within their other curricula. So let's say through business studies or citizenship or whatever it might be. And actually, interestingly, what's interesting about individual liberty is that it is promoted very much through the idea of the world of work, which I think is quite curious. Right. So like we allow people the opportunity to choose their future. So it's a very, very narrow idea of what liberty might be. And it's all, it all seems to be a very sort of neoliberal capitalist idea about work. I was going to say, you didn't seem to hint, you blatantly stated that this is not going well in the UK. No. So on one level, and perhaps this is the overly simplistic politicians around the world, they go, if we can get kids to understand what the rule of law is, individual liberty, mutual respect and democracy, that surely can't hurt. That can surely be a positive thing. Right. But you're saying it's not going well. What's going on, and why is it not going well? So I think this is actually a really good example of where a lot of people have been saying in the last couple of weeks that the Western world needs to examine white supremacy, and needs to root it out at its core. And white supremacy exists in very, very many different ways. On one end of the spectrum, of course, is attacks and examples like we've had here. But it exists across a spectrum in very different ways, a great number of different ways. And if we look at these values, on one level, they seem like really uncontested. You know, who could say, who can contest democracy, right? Yeah. They're actually incredibly white values, right? Right. They are Eurocentric Enlightenment values, and what's very interesting is the way that these are taught is. To quote verbatim from one of the resources, was things like Britain has a system of the rule of law. Britain's rule of law has been copied by many countries around the world. So there's a really clear example there of a school that is blindly ignoring Britain's colonial legacy by just saying countries copy our rule of law. So like there's ignorance there, or there's evidence there of the way that this moderate ideology is somehow demonstrating that well, let's start that sentence again. I think they're clearly white values, or they're clearly Eurocentric values, and they're promoting this as if once everyone agrees with these values, then problems will be solved. I was just looking. Jason's just brought up all those wonderful countries that chose without any force at all to copy the laws of England. Yeah, I just remember all those stories I've heard in school when Māori first met, James Cook, and how they happily copied his laws. Yeah, that's interesting. You keep saying white. Is that? I mean, England's history, England's past, England's origins as Caucasian people. Is that? I think in society, some people see the idea, like they think about white privilege, they think about white imposing their views on stuff. Is there a difference between those laws are white, or they're just, buried within the origins of England, which was a primarily Caucasian country? So, to give an example of how this works out in practice, I think maybe answers that question from a sideways angle. Sure. Which is that, so what's very, very interesting is that when so you got these values, and what one way that people are or that the strategy works is that if somebody appears not to be fulfilling one of these values, then that is then a worry or a concern or a threat. So you mean literally there's a little mark can be made and this person is not. So let's keep an eye on this one. Yeah, a mark can be put, like a black mark on the register, but they can be interviewed by police. Really? There's a program called the Channel Intervention Program, which is it's a sort of a remedial program that people like a remedial program for democracy. Precisely. Oh my God. Now, the vast majority of people that get put through this program, you won't be surprised to hear, you're gonna say, are British Muslims. Yeah. So that's a really clear example of where these values, clearly there is a racial element to these values. Right. They are, so when I say they're white values, I mean that when a white person in a British school somehow doesn't promote these values, they don't get looked on. They don't get they don't get noticed.
Okay.
But when somebody a person of color in a British school is not promoting these values, that apparently is a threat and a concern. So that's a way in which they are racialized.
So that's a little bit like, it's a different example, but when there's stats that show within New Zealand, if a Pākehā gets convicted of a crime and a Māori gets convicted of the same crime, same kind of background, the Māori will get a more harsher sentence, a more harsher outcome from the courts than the Pākehā.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right, gotcha.
Like
I'm interested as well, Jace, could you bring up the news article, Kieran's news article, because something that you mentioned towards the end of it, I'm not going to quote it for you exactly, perhaps I am if I can see it, but you talked about, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things we need to do is having effective education within the school, in the school system.
Yeah.
So if what they're doing in the UK is essentially not effective, what do we want to see? What would your opinion be? Like if the Minister of Education came to you and said, what do we need to do? What would you be looking at? Because I would think that the Ministry of Education, if they are going to look at something, would look to people like the UK at the moment and see what they're doing.
Well, I really hope they don't.
Okay, I can understand why. But so what should we be teaching our kids?
So I think the kind of conversations that people have been calling for in wider society need to be being had
Such
with children. Discussions around violence, contemporary violence and historical violence, and the fact that their white supremacy is a current that runs through history into the present. And so that can be tackled in schools. Why shouldn't it be tackled in schools? I think my knowledge of New Zealand's education system is that's not where my research is taking place. But if I look at a British example, like, it's fascinating how woefully underrepresented violent elements of British history are placed within, say, school textbooks, right? So there'll be a chapter in a school history textbook around 9/11 today, but there won't be about the Amritsar massacre in India, where a similar number of people died. Don't fact check me on that. On that specific comparison, but the point still stands that these textbooks are very uncomfortable, or are. No, I'd say that they're just very much more interested in exploring the violence of others than they are the violence of themselves.
I think one of the countries that does that well is Germany. I think Germany looks at their history of World War II, and I've got a couple of German friends, and part of them it feels like sometimes they're a little bit is the wrong word, but they're a little bit like, God, we went over World War II again and again and again. But what Germany's doing is they're going, we're not forgetting this. We're not forgetting what we've done and where we've been as a country, sort of thing. But other Western countries, you don't talk so much about it. You don't talk about the massacres. You talk about it's like the victors are the ones who write the history. Yeah.
There was a really interesting debate and I don't know to what extent it made its way over here, but within the British media recently about Winston Churchill. And the debate was as to, I think at some point he's been voted like the best Briton ever, or one of these sort of relatively
him and Robbie Williams.
Oh yeah, so it's like these relatively meaningless polls around and for some reason his history is one that we are no longer allowed to explore or to mention or to highlight, in the fact that he was instrumental in inventing the concentration camp, or the fact that he had appalling attitudes. He was a massive racist, and you could see that in his policies, and in the this man had an incredibly violent life, and he inflicted an incredible amount of violence. In Britain we don't explore like let's say the bombing of Dresden, right? That's not that long ago when it was okay for Britain to murder civilians, right? So like it's interesting that it's interesting that societies and state education systems and the media are constantly are constantly attempting to appropriate what is seen to be an appropriate sphere of violence that we're allowed to talk about, and then it ignores all the others.
There's an element of this that's tribal. And there's been 2 or 3 times I've thought, I worked as a talkback host on talkback radio for 10 years. And I've thought of 2 specific events that I talked about. And the first one was when you were talking about terrorism. And it was during the period that George W. Bush was in office, and that there was a lot going on in Iraq. And I did a talkback one night where I said, what leader, what country, who is causing the most terror on the face of the planet today?
Right.
And my point was actually George W. Bush's geopolitical current situation was causing more terror on the face of the planet to build than anybody else. Therefore, does that make George W. Bush a terrorist? And I'd throw out questions and another time I remember talking about Hiroshima, and basically talking about, was that the worst war crime ever committed? Because, Geneva Convention talks about civilians and talks about, there's a no-go area. And both of those things I got massive pushback from.
Right.
They were, ultimately it was a sad thing that's happened to those innocent people, but it was a good in the long run.
All right, that's a utilitarian argument around, it would have...
but if it was the other way... if it was the other way, then that would be still probably a commemoration Anzac Day type event today. If it was the other side that did it to the Allies or to, our mates or those that looked like us, it would be a very different thought around it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not surprised to hear that you got pushback from that, because I think it's not a comfortable thing to think about. But I think it's really important that when we are speaking around sort of looking at terrorism and counter-terrorism around the world globally, that we need to be critical about the ways that we are speaking around certain forms of violence being legitimate and certain forms of being illegitimate. Yeah.
Well, is violence ever legitimate, in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, no. But
never? So would you... what's the name of the department at university? Is it Peace and...
The National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies.
Yeah, okay. So I've done a few conversations before, recorded conversations, and I did one once on war. And on one side of the conversation, I had pacifists, including some of the guys, and it might be before your time, but they took down the spy base in Waihopai.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that group of guys, the Ploughshares, they're called. I had them as part of the conversation.
Cool.
And then I had some guys on the other side who were just war guys, including a guy who fought in Afghanistan, maybe it was Iraq, with the British Army. Mm-hmm. And it always came to that conversation, maybe we like to wrap things up too simply. Right, there's 80. That's 80 from the Waihopai 3.
Oh, yeah.
He's my mate.
Yeah.
That if the... And I guess this is... We're kind of stepping away from the original conversation, but that's what we sort of do here, is that if there's never a right time for violence, and I'm not disagreeing with you, I just really want to think this through, the reason that this conversation came up was I did talkback one night, and there was a really interesting story about this Christian guy who had a so-called epiphany when he was in Iraq, and he said, I serve a God of peace and I can't shoot and kill people anymore. Mm-hmm. And so he got an honourable discharge. So I actually ran a 6-hour talkback show on, can a Christian fight in war, when they're kind of commanded to, thou shalt not kill thy neighbour's goat, or whatever the thing is. And the thing that happened was, half of the people who phoned up and identified themselves as Christians said, no, of course you can't, because you're supposed to love your neighbour.
Yeah.
And then half of them phoned up and said, well, of course you can, because you're supposed to love your neighbour. And if Australia was being invaded, we'd go and help them.
Yeah.
And then there's this impasse of how do you then move forward. I don't know if I've asked you a question in there, but I'm just throw it to you and see what you come back at me with.
I quite like sidelining that question, and instead throwing forward the idea of asking a sort of a second question, which is like, well, let's also ask, like, how useful has violence been? And I think it is a very legitimate argument to say that violence produces more violence. counter-violence. It produces a society in which violence is seen as legitimate, and so on and so forth. So, aside from moral or ethical arguments, I mean, you could argue that the Iraq War, I'm sure you could use just war theory. I think you'd have to be creative, but I'm sure you could use just war theory to argue that the Iraq War was a just war.
I think you probably would be too.
You could pretty easily use international law to prove that it was a crime against humanity and a war crime. You can for most cases, you can probably produce. You can certainly produce an argument that is convincing for a number of people on both sides of that question. So that's why I quite like sidelining it and saying, well, let's be honest, how useful is violence? Why is it that we are not willing as a society to have a conversation around exploring and investing in exploring and research around non-violent approaches to certain things?
I agree. But do you think that the ideology of non-violence, of which I would love to participate, let's put it this way, I've never been in a fist fight in my life.
Right.
Literally never.
So why don't you just embrace it?
No, I do. I'm not saying that, but I guess I think I take a step back and I think, so therefore, what do we do when not all of society chooses to adhere to that, and then when their ideology is pushing on us? And it might be it might be an instance like when have been physically threatened or something.
Right.
I'm not trying to be a dick and go, well, what happens if someone tries to punch me? What do I do? Yeah. I'm actually trying to think about the reality of the idea and how that would look, because I'm actually with you completely.
Well, I mean, on this subject, there's been very interesting research that has shown that not only is violence ineffective when people are being violent towards you, violence doesn't work as a response. But there's been studies that have shown that quite the opposite, that non-violence is more effective against violence than a violent response. So when we're taking examples of, imagine a sort of and I can't think of a specific example, but of a repressive regime.
I'll give you two examples. So to help your point, there's 2 or 3 times that they say Hitler was defeated during his reign. Right. One was by a priest who got into one of the cars going to one of the camps, refused to get out, and they wouldn't send the cart. Another one was one of the kings, and I don't think this is urban myth. Jace, you could look this up. A local king from Europe who, the gay community had to wear a certain colour. He chose to wear the colour. All of the citizens wore the colour. Hitler could do nothing about it.
Right. Good examples of resistance, absolutely.
Yeah. Unless that's an urban myth, but
I hadn't heard that before.
No.
Yeah. So not your question, your initial question was well, how do we, if someone's being
if someone else's ideology impinges on us,
or if someone is being violent to us, well then. Studies have shown that non-violence is a more effective means of resistance than violence in that context. It leads to fewer deaths so there are examples of repressive regimes where there's been like a resistance movement, like the Arab Spring kind of a resistance movement, right? Where those movements are themselves non-violent, there are fewer people die in the uprising than if they were using violence, and that uprising is more likely to be successful.
Do you think it's easier to speak in these ideologies en masse? Like I can imagine 10,000 people marching, the Martin Luther King, the peaceful movement, Gandhi, peaceful movement, a lot easier than one dude down the octagon going, no, I'm not going to do anything about this, and getting king hit sort of thing. Maybe you need to have a society around you, a big portion of society, to make it happen. Yeah,
definitely.
I mean, and again, I don't like trying to pick out individual single examples. But if the police had turned up while dude was actually shooting the mosque, seeing that's what we were here, he was actually participating in it, they would have shot him and killed him and saved some lives. That would have been an act of violence that would have saved some lives. How does that sit within this idea?
To challenge that idea, as I mentioned in this article, Belgium is a really important case to look at this, which is that Belgium was attacked in 2015,
right,
in Brussels. There was attacks in Brussels, and its response was to put the military on the streets, right?
Right.
So you go through Brussels Central train station, and there was Humvees, as you walk in, and everywhere there are soldiers with their big guns or wearing camouflage, and it's all it's a great performance of security. It didn't stop attacks happening again, and so I think that there is there's a great assumption that scenario that you just put forward could potentially happen.
Yeah.
And what is important is when we look at New Zealand's response to these the attacks on the mosques in Christchurch is to make sure that we're not making those same mistakes. So don't make the mistake of putting heaps of armed police on the streets.
Well, that has happened. Do you think? Because is there a middle ground? Has there been an appropriate amount of that without going overboard? What do you think?
I think certainly the certain elements of the middle ground in New Zealand in terms of like going straight ahead with gun control has been excellent.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at that actually. Let's pause, because again, back to your article, you talked about the dust settling in your article, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously this dust won't settle for weeks, if not months, if not years.
Yeah.
But certainly you wrote that article. I was going to ask you as well, it's a little side note here, but we'll come back to the dust settling. I heard of the shooting when I was at home. I get my messages through to my phone, like there's Herald messages and stuff messages right now, and something about an adorable unicorn. That must be my daughter sending it to me. And I saw a shooting in Christchurch, and I thought, that's terrible news, but didn't pay too much attention to it. There was stuff about Hagley Park, didn't pay too much attention to it. I don't know, it must have been 5 o'clock. The news item came down up to 27 dead. And I was like, what the actual fuck? And that was when I kind of went TV, computer, iPad, looking around, figuring out what had happened on. For you, what on the day, how did you find it? What was the reaction, especially being in the study that you're at? Did you pick up on it quite quickly? Because you wrote that article within hours of it happening, yeah?
I did, yes. Yeah. It was a very difficult day. And yeah, so I mean, I think I found out the story, I think by chance, fairly early on in the afternoon, and as soon as I saw that, when it was started describing that it was a shooting at a mosque, that was, I think, for me, enough of a signal that this will be a politically motivated form of violence. And yeah, it certainly is over those couple of hours. As the story unfolded, it became very clear that this was a terrorist attack, and So at that point, there was I suppose a concern that that the response in the media might be quite heavily security focused,
right?
And
so were you preempted that what might happen based on what you'd seen in the UK and stuff?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so I was keen to contribute to that. Keen to contribute to that discussion in order to try and I suppose I was somewhat relieved that security response hasn't come about, or rather there are certain things I mentioned, such as gun control, which were embraced with open arms, which is brilliant.
So let's go back then. We're talking about, you write in part of the article about the dust settling. Hasn't settled yet, won't settle for a long time, but you do mention this is within hours of the attack, gun control. Yeah. You've seen the Prime Minister, and people are talking about Jacinda in such a positive light, I think correctly, but also we've got to give credit to, there's no one who's voted against it. I know that Seymour from ACT has kind of said, we should be careful how quickly we move with this, but everyone supported it. Mm-hmm. So now that you've got 2 weeks on and the dust is more settled than 2 hours on, how are you feeling about the response, the way that the government in particular has responded to the issue, the terrorist attack?
I suppose my honest answer, I want to say I don't know. Is that okay?
That's a perfectly good answer.
Yeah.
Thinking about what you wrote and thinking about concerns that perhaps there's going to be tanks on the road.
Yes. Yeah, no, certainly. I don't think I was ever particularly concerned about them taking the extent of the... I am nervous about how it may play within the trajectory of the debate around the arming of police. Because that... it wasn't so long ago that in Christchurch there was that debate emerged because there had been some armed incident of some description, I can't remember what it was, precisely, that had led to the Christchurch police everyone being armed for a short period of time, and so there was debate emerged inevitably as a response to that policy as to whether police should be armed permanently. And so I think those concerns remain in the sense of in terms of those wider terscussions around trying to create a more non-violent society, rather than one thing that can happen through having your police be more armed, having more arms is being more visibly armed is a normalization.
I read something. I think most of the commentary I've seen that's come out has been pretty against the idea of this leading to the police being armed. Now, I'm not saying all of it. Maybe I have a particular narrative in my feed which shows me those over something else. Right. But, just I think yesterday I was reading, research will show that if your police are armed, your crims, your people who are trying to get around the law will be more well armed. So if they're not armed... I think
there's certainly a good argument in terms of that sort of circularity of there's sort of essentially the same kind of logic as the Cold War arms race, right? There's sort of, you've got this much, so I've got to have this much. And I think that's a legitimate argument, I think, in this case. On that point, I think New Zealand, like the UK, has it's a very different the conversation and the talk is a very, very different it's in a different space here than it is in other parts of Europe and in the US in terms of...
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we're talking about it differently here?
I don't know about the New Zealand case, but the British case is historically the role of the police has always been different to say like trying to think about this. I haven't thought about this for a while, but the origins of the police force in Britain is very, very different to the gendarmerie in France, for instance. So when Robert Peel started the police in the UK, it was always an idea that they would be citizens in uniform rather than like a domestic army. And that distinction was very, very clear from the start.
So a local member of the community who's tasked with that job.
Precisely. And that kind of underlying understanding as to what the role of the police should be has to some extent remained. Now, at the same time, Britain is also following the US's response in the militarization of its armed offenders squads. And so you have the similar kind of like the SWAT team tactics, right? So on one level you've got this legacy of not having your regular police being armed, and then on the same scale you've got the over militarization of the armed trying to think, right, it's like armed response units, or I can't remember the right phrase. So
armed offenders squad, AOS in New Zealand, armed offenders squad.
That's what it is here, is it? So I think it's when we mention that, it's important to mention that too. And just looking at this pictures of the armed offender squad on the screen here, like it's hard to see how that is anything other than a member of a military unit, right? So and certainly it's terrifying in the US the way that local police forces in the US have access to knockoffs from the
I wonder if part of it, maybe this is not for the UK, maybe this is more for the US, is our attitudes towards just guns in general. Thanks, bro. I read one of those farmers who has chosen to give up his guns, and he said very clearly, like I connect, I have a lot of kind of American contacts or people I connect with in America and talk with and chat with online, and that sort of thing. And one of the differences, we don't arm ourselves for protection. And it was said beautifully by a farmer, it's for pests and stock control. That's why he has guns. Right. So him giving up his semi-automatic weapon doesn't mean anything. Whereas Americans, they buy weapons to protect themselves. It's their reason for having guns. Yeah. And because we don't have the same relationship with guns, I wonder if that's got any reason towards why we're doing it differently to some others.
I feel like there's another reason which you haven't mentioned that I think exists in New Zealand and exists in the US and exists around the world, which is the idea of guns for entertainment.
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean, you've mentioned pest control, you've mentioned protection. I think there's definitely a very good argument to suggest that the kind of weapons that have been banned now in New Zealand and the kind of guns that are being used in mass shootings in the US, are rubbish at both of those things, right?
Yeah.
Gun experts mention how bad how bad these semi-automatic rifles are in the context of like an intruder in your home, right?
Yeah.
And let's. I mean, it'd be laughable to think about trying to talk about possums with a semi-automatic rifle, right? Like, so. Yeah, I think there's an uncomfortable discussion.
Yeah,
I think
the farmer that was giving up his guns said he bought them about 15 years ago, and he said, if there was a group of 5 goats, he might be able to drop 3 of them, and before they ran away. But I hear what you're saying about entertainment. Right. I mean, if I'm going skeet shooting, I'm using a shotgun. If I'm going duck shooting, I'm using a shotgun. If so I think as well. I think that they're unnecessary. And it's been interesting watching the American reaction, actually. You'll probably roll your eyes, but I follow everyone and I read everything. And for some reason, my algorithm's been picking up frickin' Glenn Beck a lot in the last wee while. I know, I don't know why. But basically, stories about New Zealand, people giving up their guns, and the one word kind of post is like unbelievable. And it's just like they don't get it. They don't get that we don't have guns to protect us, and they don't get that the farmer that's giving up his gun has a shotgun and has a lever action as well. It's what they do.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I'm not a gun control expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there are a number of very interesting factors as to why people don't want to give these things up, and in America, it's tied into very sort of Americanized cultural understandings of liberty and so on. And I find it bemusing that people don't understand also that in having a weapon in their own house, they are endangering their own lives in the sense of how many people get killed and hurt by their own guns, by mistakes,
or someone
children picking it up, and all this sort of stuff. So. So I'm very relieved to hear about the gun control aspect. If you were
to like gun control as a positive, you're saying, if you were to see what else, like if you could ask for another initiative to come, another something to be rolled out by the government, what else would you like to see to help the situation that we're talking about, especially around safety, security, non-violence? Is there anything else from this that needs to come out of it?
I think that the response needs to be the much bigger conversation than one around security. So
we're talking about the next question, like we started with.
Yeah, we're talking about anti-racism education. We're talking about acknowledging the Islamophobia across New Zealand society. It's about talking about the violent roots of New Zealand's colonial history. All of those sorts of things. The one thing we haven't mentioned, of course, is that there's going to be a royal commission into this.
And it's already the biggest police investigation the country has ever seen.
Right, for sure. And another topic we haven't talked about is very interesting response to the manifesto of this guy, right?
Which is now a crime to own.
Yes, it's labelled. I can't remember the right phrase.
Have you seen the manifesto?
Interesting. Someone from our department on the day of that it was taking place on the Friday afternoon had emailed around some quotations from it. So I'm aware of some of the through that. I'm aware of some of the content. And what's very interesting is that this particular document has been banned, or it's been labelled. I can't remember the right word, but it's been sort of what is it? Here we go. It's objectionable. That's the word. Yes. And what's very interesting. So this, I think, is I can see why the government has done it. What I find very interesting about what I have seen from the manifesto is aside from its belief that a massive moment of violence will somehow catalyze what they want. Aside from that, what's fascinating is how normalized a lot of the ideas and political ideas are within it. So ideas around a sense that, a narrative that we hear all the time around the idea that migration is somehow a threat to certain populations, or the idea that I don't know, I think that's the only one that springs to mind immediately, but that kind of idea is so widely disseminated across media platforms. You talk in your article, and also you mentioned it here a couple of times, about Islamophobia. The idea of Islamophobia, how do we teach, how do we educate? I guess I also kind of want to know, what does it mean? What is Islamophobia? I think that, in my opinion, for example, the word racism gets used in times now that may not be what would be the technical definition of racism, but we've sort of moved a bit and redefined it. So how would you define Islamophobia? I think it's a hard question. And I think that it's really important that we all it's a question I've been sitting and thinking about and trying to learn in the last couple of weeks. I think Islamophobia exists when trying to think of a good example of a way that Islamophobia exists in society that is less objectionable, should we say, than than like the attacks. Because I think it's a tricky word, because it can exist in all walks of life, and it exists in very many different ways. From this isn't a particularly succinct answer. We don't have to do succinct. That's the relief. White supremacy. Yeah. Let's start there. White supremacy, in my mind, is the belief that the belief in the superiority of the white race, white people, of white people or white ideas. Yep. Okay. So that's that. I agree. That's a very clear definition of what white supremacy. So the word supremacy in itself. Yeah, and so that can exist in very many different ways. Yep. It can exist in an idea that certain places around the world should be for white people only. Yep. It can exist also in a sense that while this place in the world can be for a number of different people, everyone must ascribe to a certain set of values that themselves are Eurocentric or have that kind of history. So here's a good question. So if let's say a country is dominated by Caucasians, let's say that a lot of the laws are made in favour of, like you're talking before about, like the the penal system in New Zealand. It's weighted to be more favourable to Europeans than anybody else. Is it white supremacy if through institutional racism? And I think for me, institutional racism, sometimes the people involved with that aren't actually aware of their actions because it's institutionalized. It's a part of how we do things, so to speak. Well, I was going to say, if someone's coming up through that and they've operated through that and they're making, say, laws through that, but within that there is an inherent bias towards the white Caucasian race, would you, in your opinion, define that as white supremacy, or do you need to be actively involved in that?
Okay, wow. So you're saying there is unwitting white supremacists?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a term that's used to label those that are the most archetypal example of it. And one of the reasons why it's a label that's pushed to only label those on the extremes is because no one wants to acknowledge the white supremacy of the moderate. So let's take the word extreme, right?
Yep.
So extremism is, now governments try to label extremism as utterly exceptional and very, very different to an idea
on the edges,
that is right on the edges, that is completely different.
Way out.
But also, if you're going to call something an extreme, it has to be an extreme form of a moderate thing.
Yep.
So there's something that ties that moderate to that extreme.
Yep.
And so what I think is a really important question we need to ask as a society is, what is it that is tying the attitudes of the moderate to the attacks in Christchurch?
Right. And that says to me it's sort of like concentric circles. There's the, let's say the Nazi, the active white supremacist, who's skinhead Heil Hitler in the centre.
Yeah.
But then there's a group around that who are, and you go further and further out, even though they're concentric circles around that same idea, they're getting more and more, let's say, liberal as they go out, but there is a connecting line.
Yeah, so there's links between institutional racism and violent white supremacy. There's links to immigration policy. There's links to school history textbooks.
Yeah.
There's the same idea is tracing through that.
So if we can define, it seems fairly easily, white supremacy, why are we struggling to define Islamophobia?
I was struggling to define Islamophobia earlier. I think.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Because I was trying to think of like a dictionary definition.
Well, I mean, to me, Islamophobia, phobia is fear.
Yeah.
Fear of Islam.
So the reason why I wanted to come to Islamophobia from the point of looking at white supremacy is the belief in the superiority of the white idea or the white person.
Yep.
So Islamophobia then is a manifestation of white supremacy in the context of Islam. Does that make sense?
Manifestation of white supremacy in the context of Islam. Yep.
Yeah. So it's that sense of let's give different examples. Like in France currently through its legacy of secularism, currently has a for some reason the French government, even though liberty is a core French value, feels like it can decide what French women should wear. Yep. It seems to have laws of I can't remember who was it? Now I'm trying to think who said that it is as oppressive to demand women to wear less as it is oppressive to demand them to wear more. So you're
talking about banning the burqa and that kind of stuff.
And the idea of on the other end of the scale, asking people to wear more, like cover up, right? Yeah. So you got those two things happening in the same society. So I think it's a really good example of one form of Islamophobia. You got another form of Islamophobia when
although you have tied that form to white supremacy. I mean, obviously you don't have to be white to be an Islamophobe.
No.
Yeah.
No. Perhaps they're. Yeah.
So anyone could be Islamophobic, no matter what race, creed, religion, colour. Could they? I mean, I'm sorry, I should ask this question.
Yeah. No, as far as my as far as my understanding goes.
The interesting, I go back to my talkback roots. The interesting thing about the banning of the burqa and stuff, to me, it always seemed a fairly easy solution. It's like if you need to have your face uncovered, for example, in a bank or in a courtroom or for a photo ID, then there's no way around that. But other than that, you can cover your face. I mean, I was riding a scooter those days.
Yeah.
I had my face covered every time. I'd walk into the dairy because I didn't want to take all my gear off. Yeah. And I'd do it.
Precisely.
And then there's just a simple choice. If you don't want to be identified in a place that's secure, then you just don't enter that. Just like I couldn't enter that with my bike helmet on.
Yeah,
it just seems like a simple.
Yeah, right? I can see that perspective. I mean, certainly in that.
That was very polite. I can see that perspective, you dick.
That's not what I said. Yeah, like it's so that example from I think it was a beach in Cannes in France, and you'd see people surfing, wearing a hood, I suppose, right? Like a neoprene, like a wetsuit,
a burkini.
Well, no, it wasn't.
It was just someone.
I just mean someone surfing.
Oh, right, gotcha.
Yeah,
because it's a cold day.
Gotcha. And apparently that's acceptable. There's a great picture of on the screen there.
And that's where the ludicrous things about banning things out. And that was one of the things I used to say. Like I ride a motorbike. Yeah. Do I now have to have a faceless motorbike helmet because it was ridiculous?
And there's it was a really good video that someone posted on Facebook about a week ago, and it was some old footage of it's about 1913, I think, something like that in the UK, and everyone was it was just people walking through a street, and it was really very interesting that at that moment in time it was the fashion that women would wear shawls, and someone posted and they just asked the question of how is this, how is this any different to...
So the shawl would be over the head?
Yeah. So like it was and I think it's that kind of thing is important to recognize, in the sense of, like, when it comes to that language around Western values, like we're ascribing some sort of universal Western value to something contemporary, whereas like it wasn't. That was different. It was different 100 years ago. So how can you make that claim?
And in the West, primarily a Christian kind of thing, women were supposed to cover their heads. It was a part of their belief system that's been around for 2 millennia. Cover your heads, etc., etc. Anyway.
Yeah.
Hey, I feel like I don't even know what time it is. Time normally flies. This is a bit of a time. It's 6:20. We've been going for nearly an hour and a half. So I don't want to hold you forever.
Okay.
I mean, I could. We could keep talking. I was just wondering a place to finish on, because obviously we're talking today because of a pretty horrific terrorist event that has ongoing repercussions, not just for New Zealand but for the world. I'm not an academic, and I'm not as intrinsically daily involved in this kind of stuff as you. I look to how we as a country are responding at the moment, and I feel quite proud. I think that this group of society that's been attacked, such a small group. I mean, I walked into a fruit and veggie shop the other day, and a girl walked in behind me, and she had a head covering on. I just wanted to go, oh, it's so good to have you here with us. It's, just to be a part of us. And I think it feels trite to say what good can come from this, because 50 people have died, and no one's actually said this, but I wonder if more will, because there's still a dozen or so in intensive care. But I'm just wondering what to leave our conversation with. I'm wondering what to go out on. Is there anything, or is there nothing that can be said and we should just go and get Reburger? And
I think so. My response to that would be to kind of reflect on my 2 weeks, is it now? And I know in saying this there's a certain irony in that we've been talking for the last hour and a half or whatever it might be, but since having written that article, one of the things I realized that I needed to do was to stop talking and to listen, and so obviously there's an irony in saying that, having to spend time talking today, but I think that particularly people who are not people who experience violence every day or don't experience insecurity need to stop and listen, and to do and there I'm speaking of Pākehā, and I'm thinking also of men. We need to listen, and we need to reflect, and we need to ask very difficult questions. And so while I think these things can be very difficult, and while sometimes it seems like answers are impossibly difficult, actually I think one of the reasons we think that they're impossibly difficult is because we haven't done enough listening. Yeah, I guess that's my
So I have a favour to ask you, and this is going to put you on the spot, and you can say, I'll think about it, or you can say, nah, rack off, or whatever. If we need to ask ourselves some hard questions,
yeah,
which is what you've just said, how would you feel about doing another op-ed where you pitch to those of us who now need to think and ask ourselves some questions, what some of those questions could be? And I know it might be different for every person, but it seems to me that if we can then supply, and if you wanted, we'll put it up on the thing, or if you've got a blog, we can promote it for you. I think that what some of us, and I'll put my hand up, need is maybe a hand to start some of those conversations as well. Maybe it would be interesting to hear a perspective which are, let's start with these questions. Let's ask ourselves these questions.
I think the difficult irony is that people have been offering that for some time, and we haven't been listening. So rather than I suggest, why don't I write something? Well, I think it's already been written, and we haven't listened, and we haven't read it. Yeah.
Thanks for coming in.
No worries.
I know it's been a bit heavy. I mean, for obvious reasons, but I think it's really important, and I've really enjoyed the chat. Kieran Ford.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, sir.